In this video, I will show you how to implement user registration, authentication, and authorization in Spring Boot Web APIs using Json Web Tokens. Then in the next video, I will show you how to implement role-based authorization. You can find the video link in the description. First, let's create a new project. So we can select Maven and Java. We can choose the latest version of Spring Boot. Let's set the group ID and the artifact. So we can call this project My Web API. Then let's add the dependencies. So first we need Spring Web. Then we need Spring Security. We will connect to MySQL, so we need the MySQL driver. And we will use Spring JPA. Also, we need the validation dependency. Now let's generate the project. I will save it on the desktop. Now let's extract this zip file and let's open it using an IDE. I will open it using Eclipse. Now let's configure the application to connect to the MySQL database. So let's expand the resources and let's open this file. Then let's add additional properties. So we need to add the driver class name, we need to add the URL of the database, so we will connect to this database that we need to create. This is the username, I don't have any password. We can add this optional property to display the SQL queries on the console, and we need to add this property like this. The database will be updated each time we update the entity models. Then let's create this database. So here I will use example that contains MySQL, and I can connect to MySQL using phpMyAdmin. So let's click on admin and let's create a new database. Then create. And now we have this new database. Now let's create a new controller. So let's create a new class. And let's create it in the controllers package. Let's call it home controller. Let's annotate it with the REST controller. And let's create two routes. So we can create this route that is accessible using the get method, and we will return the text home page. And we can create this second route that is accessible also using the get method, and we will return the text store page. Let's add the required package. Let's save all the files and let's run the application. So let's go to the main file. Then let's test the application using Postman. Let's send a GET request to the root URL. But here we can see that we have unauthorized. This is because by default all the routes of the application are protected. Now let's change the configuration of our application. So let's create a new class. Let's create it in the config package. And let's call it security config. So this class will be used to configure the security of the application, so we need to annotate it with two annotations. We need to add configuration and enable web security. Then let's register a new bean that allows us to configure the security filter chain. So we need to register a new bean of type security filter chain. We can define these security rules. So the root URL will be public. Any route that starts with /store will be public. The route /account/login and /account/register will be public. And any other route requires the user authentication. Also, we are creating a web API, so we don't need the CSRF protection and we can disable it. Also, we can disable the default authentication using login and passwords. And because we will use JWT authentication, we need to use the stateless session policy. Let's save the file and let's restart the application. So now the application is running correctly and it is accessible at this port number. Now let's send a request to the root URL using the get method. And this time we have this success response with the text homepage. Now let's create a new entity model that allows us to read and write users in the database. So let's create a new class. Let's create it in the models package. And let's call it AppUser. We can call it user, but later we will use a class defined by Spring Security which is called user. So to get rid of any confusion, we can call this entity model AppUser. Let's annotate this class. So we need to add the entity annotation because this is an entity model, and you can add this annotation to define the name of the table in the database. So we can store the different users in the users table. Let's add the required packages. Then let's define the different fields of this class. So we need the user ID, which is the primary key and it is auto-incremental. We need the first name, the last name, the email address that should be unique. We need the phone number, the address, the password, the role to implement the role-based authorization, and the date. Let's import the package. So in this video, I will show you how to authenticate users using the email address and the password. Now let's add the getters and setters. Then let's create a JPA repository that allows us to read and write the users in the database. So let's create a new interface and let's create it in the repositories package. Let's call it AppUser repository. Let's extend the JPA repository. And let's declare a new method that allows us to find users by email address. Let's save all the files and let's restart the application. So here we can see that the users table has been created. We can go to the database. Let's click on the database. So we can see that we have this new table. Now we need to create a new class that allows us to generate and to validate the Json Web Tokens. So let's create a new class. Let's create it in the services package. And let's call it JWT service. And let's annotate it with the service annotation. Then let's define new properties in application.properties. So we can define the secret key that will be used to generate the Json Web Tokens. We can define the expiration time of the JWT tokens, and we can also define the issuer of the tokens. Then let's read these different properties in the JWT service. Then we need to add a new library to this application that allows us to encode and decode the JWT tokens. So we can go to the browser, and here we can type Java JWT. So we can type Java JWT GitHub, and let's go to this link. So we will use this library. Let's click on installation. And let's copy these dependencies. and let's add them to the POM file. Let's save all the files. Now let's create a new method that allows us to generate the JSON Web Token. So we can call it create a JWT token. It requires the application user and it returns the JSON Web Token. So here we will create the key using the secret key that we already defined in application.properties. So here we will use this secret key. Then we will create the JWT. So we will set the subject, that will be the email address of the user, the issued at, the issuer that we already defined in application.properties, the expiration date, and we will sign this JWT using this key. Then let's create a new method that allows us to verify the token. We can call it getTokenClaims. It requires the JSON Web Token, and if the token is valid, we will return the list of claims of this token, but if the token is not valid, then we will return null. So to verify if the token is valid or not, we need to create the key using the value that we already defined in application.properties. Then here we will read the claims of the token. So if the token is not valid, then this statement will throw an exception, and in this case we will return null. But if the token is valid, then we can read the different claims of this token. Then we need to check if the token is expired or not. So we need to read the expiration date of the token, and then we need to read the current date. So if the current date is before the expiration date, this means that the token is still valid and did not expire. In this case, we can return the list of claims. Otherwise, we will return null, which means that the token is not valid. Now let's save all the files and let's close them. Now I will show you how to register new users. So first let's create a DTO model. Let's call it register DTO. Let's define the different fields. So we need the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, the address, and the password. Then let's create the getters and setters. Then let's create a new controller that allows us to register users. Let's call it account controller. Let's annotate this class. So we need to add the REST controller and request mapping. Let's add the required package. Then let's request the repository AppUser repository from the application. So we can request it using the auto-wired annotation. Let's add the required packages. So this repository allows us to save the users in the database. Also, we need to request the JWT service from the application. So using the JWT service, after the successful user registration, we need to send him the JSON Web Token. Then let's create a new route that allows us to register users. So we can create this new method, the register, that is accessible using the post method at the URL /account/register. And here we need to read the submitted data that allows us to register the new user. So we need to read the data from the request body, and we need to check if the data is valid or not. If we have any validation error, then the different errors will be available in this object. And by default, this method will return a bad request. So first we need to check if the submitted data of register DTO is valid or not. So if we have any validation error, then we will read the list of errors and we will save them into this map. And we will return a bad request that contains the validation errors. Otherwise, we need to create a new application user using the submitted data of register DTO. So here we will create this object which is of type application user. We will set the first name, last name, the email address, phone number and address using the submitted data of a registered DTU. By default, the user role will be client and the date of creating this user will be the current date. So for the password, it should be encrypted. That's why we need to create this object which is of type bcrypt password encoder, and we will use it to encode the received user password. Then we need to save this user in the database. So let's add this try catch block. In the try block, we will check if we have another user having the same email address. So if we have another user, then we will return a bad request with the error message email address is already used. Otherwise, we can save this user in the database. So we will save this application user in the database using our repository. Then we will generate a new Json Web Token to this user. So we can call the JWT service.create JWT token, and this is the application user. Then we can create the response. So in the response, we will add the token and the user profile, and we will return a success response that contains this response. Now let's save all the files and let's restart the application. Now let's register a new user. So let's select the post method. And let's send a request to /account/register. So we need to add a JSON object to the request. So let's go to the body, then let's select row, and let's select JSON. And let's provide a JSON object with the user data. So we will send the first name, last name, the email address, the address, and the password. We don't need to send the phone number because it is optional. Now let's send the request. And here we can see that we have this success response, we have the user profile, and here we have the Json Web Token. Let's take a look at the database. Let's click on the name of the table. So here we can see that we have this new user, the password is encrypted, and by default the user role is client. Now I will show you how to authenticate users. So first let's create a new DTO model. Let's call it login DTO. Let's add the required fields. So we need the email address and the password. Let's add the required packages. Then let's add the getters and setters. Then let's create a new method in account controller that allows us to authenticate users. So first we need to request a service from the application. So we need to request this object which is of type Authentication Manager. It allows us to verify if the user credentials are valid or not. Then let's create a new route that allows us to authenticate users. So we can create this method that is accessible using the post method at the URL /account/login, and here we require an object of type login DTO. By default, we will return a bad request with the error message bad username or password. Then let's check if we have any validation error. So if we have any validation error, then we will return a bad request with the validation errors. Otherwise, we need to authenticate the user. So we can add this try catch block. In the try block, we can call authentication manager.authenticate, and we will check if the user email address and password are valid or not. So if the authentication is successful, then we can execute the rest of the statements of this try block. Otherwise, if the email address or password are not valid, then this statement will throw an exception. In this case, we can display this error message on the console and we can return a bad request. So if the email address and password are valid, then we can return the token and the user profile. So we can read the user details from the database using our repository. So we will read the user having the received email address. Then we can create the JWT token and we can create this response. So we will send the token and the user profile. So we will send a success response that contains this response. Now, to allow Spring Security to authenticate the user, it is necessary to create a new service that implements the user details service interface. So let's create a new service. And let's call it App User Service. Let's add the service annotation. And let's implement the user details service interface. Let's implement the method of this interface. So in our case, we will read the users by email address. So let's change the name of this parameter and let's call it email. Then let's request our repository, which is App User repository. Now let's implement this method. So first let's read the user having this email address from the database, and we will use, of course, our repository. If this application user is not null, then we need to create an object of type user details. So we can call user, which is defined by Spring Security, dot with username, and in our case the username is the email address. Then we will set the user password and the user role. Then we will create the user and we will return it. So if application user is not null, we will return this user details object, otherwise we will return null. So this service will be used by Spring Security to find the users in the database. And in our case, the user password is encrypted. So we need to register a new bean that allows Spring Security to check if the password is valid or not. So let's go to security config and let's register a new bean. So we need to register a new bean of type password encoder, which is a bcrypt password encoder. Then we need to add a new bean of type authentication manager, so we can use it in account controller. So here we can see that we are using this object, which is of type authentication manager, and we need to add it to the application. So just here we can add a new bean. So this bean is of type authentication manager. Now let's save all the files and let's restart the application. Now let's log in using this email address and this password. So let's select the post method. And we need to send the request to /account/login. So we need to send the data in the request body. So let's select body, then row, then JSON. And we will send the email address and the password. So here we can see that we have this success response. Here we have the user profile, and this is the Json Web Token. Now I will show you how to authorize users based on the Json Web Token. So first let's create a new filter that allows us to verify if the Json Web Token is valid or not. So we can create a new class in the services package or even in the filters package. So I will not create a new package and I will use the services package. Let's call it JWT authentication filter. Let's add it to the application as a service. And let's extend the class once per request filter. Now we need to implement the method doFilterInternal. But first we need to request to services that allows us to check if the Json Web Token is valid or not. So we need the JWT service and also we need the App User repository. Then let's implement this method. So we need to allow the request to access to the application. We can delete this command. And you can call filter chain to filter. This is the request and this is the response. So filter chain that we have here is this parameter. Then let's check if the token is valid or not. First, let's add this try catch block. So if we have any exception, we can display the error message on the console. Then in the try block, let's read the token. First, we need to read the bearer token from the authorization header. If bearer is null or if it does not start with bearer, this means that we don't have the Json Web Token. In this case, we can throw an exception. Otherwise, we need to read the Json Web Token from the bearer token after the word bearer. So we can create this string, which is the Json Web Token, and it is equal to bearer.substring, and we will read the Json Web Token after the word bearer. So bearer plus this space is equal to 7 characters. Then we will read the claims from this token. So we can call our service JWT service.get token claims, and this is the Json Web Token. If the token is not valid, then claims will be null. Otherwise, if the token is valid, in this case, claims will contain the different claims of the token. So if claims is null, this means that the token is not valid. In this case, we can throw an exception. Otherwise, the token is valid. So we can read the email address which is available in the token as the subject. Then we can read the user having this email address. So we can call our service app user service.load user by username, and this is the email address. So what we have here is of type user details. Then let's create an authentication token and let's authenticate the request. So we can create this authentication token that will authenticate this user, and we will add this authentication token to the context of the application. Then we will allow the application to process the request. Now we need to add this filter to the security filter chain. So let's go to security config and let's request the filter from the application. Then let's add this filter to the security filter chain. So we can call add filter before, and this is our new filter. Now let's create a new route in account controller that allows the user to see his profile. So let's go to account controller and let's create a new route. So we can create this method that is accessible using the HTTP GET method at the URL /account/profile. It requires this authentication object. Then here we will create the response. So we will send the username, which is the email address in our case, then the authorities, and then we will read the user details from the database. And we will add the user profile. So at the end we will return a success response that contains this response. So according to the security rules of our application, the route /account/profile requires the user authentication. Now let's save all the files and let's restart the application. Let's open a new tab. So let's select the GET method and let's send the request to /account/profile. Then send. But here we have this error message, forbidden. So we need to add the Json Web Token to the request. First, let's obtain the Json Web Token. So let's send a request to /account/login. Then let's copy the token. Then here, let's select authorization. Then let's select bearer token, and here let's paste the token. Now let's send the request. So this time we have a success response. Here we have the user profile. We have the username, which is the email address, and for the moment authorities is empty. So for the moment this user has no role. In the next video I will show you how to implement the role-based authorization. You can find the video link in the description.